Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibuyers, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. We're going to dive back into this bond hearing for Kouri Richins. But first, music fact of the day. Pink, one of my favorite singers. I love her. If you have a chance to see her in concert, go, because she's amazing. Like, she flies around the arena. Such a great performer. But before she was a household name, she worked at McDonald's. She said her days flipping burgers gave her financial independence, telling Food and Wine magazine, "It was important to my family that I make my own money. I was a drive-through girl at McDonald's. I had a Janet Jackson microphone. I had power." See, there you go. Never give up on your dreams. They might come true. Love me some Pink. We're going to jump back in. Chris Kouri. He is a private investigator and owns his own firm. Chris Kouri was called by the state. He's a private investigator and he owns his own firm. Before that, he was a police officer for over 20 years. He has a lot of experience with cell phone data, took several of the Cellbrite courses and other continuing education classes. You have listened to the podcast long enough, you know Cellbrite comes in almost every single trial now because digital evidence oftentimes is the heart of the cases that we cover. So that software they can put the phone information into, and it maps out locations on things like Google Earth to where to our eyes it would be just a lot of nonsense. He was also retained by the Summit County Attorney's Office to review cell phone data in this case. Call data records or cellular downloads is information that's extracted from the phone onto something like an external device. It goes into a reader so that he can analyze the data from there. A carrier record is the usage of the phone through your carrier. It records the date and time of your calls, text, your data usage, and your location information. There can be discrepancies between the call data record or extraction and the carrier data. This is usually due to the fact that it just wasn't captured in the phone download due to a software limitation, but they typically see it through deletion of data, so it doesn't match the carrier records. He reviewed the contents of Kouri's phone that was seized in April of 2022, and it had information from March the 3rd into the early morning of March the 4th, which is the date that Eric died. The last activity on March 3rd on Kouri's phone was movement at 10:33 p.m. The next time her phone was used was 3:07 a.m. on March the 4th. Between those two time frames, nothing happened on the phone. It was moved during this time frame, and using Cellbrite, it gives a connected device activity movement. Usually that means it's connected to another device like a tablet or your Apple Watch or smartwatch. The two devices kind of talk to each other and they report movements to each other. If you have Apple, you can go into your health app. If you have an Apple Watch, your steps taken that day, if you're recording them, will be on your iPhone. So that's how he was describing this essentially. At 3:22 a.m., a 911 call was made. Between 3:07 and 3:22, there was activity on her phone. At 3:07 a.m., the phone was unlocked. At 3:08 a.m., movement is detected either on the device itself or through another connected device that is moving. At 3:12, the phone was unlocked, and at 3:16 in the morning, it was unlocked again. At 3:19, the phone unlocked again, potentially twice. 3:21, there's movement detected, and at 3:22 a.m., the 911 call is made. That's 15 minutes from the phone being unlocked the first time to the time when 911 was called. He said it could be an Apple Watch that was detecting movement, but so far, he has not been able to identify what device the phone was actually connected to. He said he may be able to at some point, but no luck so far. The movement is significant to him for occurring inside the home. The 3:08 a.m. movement was several feet. And there were two significant movements on the iPhone right before 911 was called. One was about 240 feet and the other was about 130 feet. That's right before she called 911. There were patterns of deletion seen on the phone, and there's gaps in web history and searches, and specifically the call log for calls and texts. There's messaging included in the carrier report, but not logged onto the device itself. He noticed this more in the weeks prior to Eric's death than before. The deleted calls were going to several people, and as far as this case, the main ones deleted were the communications to CL, who was the middleman for the fentanyl. He analyzed the extraction of a second phone belonging to Kouri that was seized in May of this year. Activity on this second device began shortly after her first phone was seized in April of last year. He looked at internet searches on the second phone and made a PowerPoint of those searches. He could see when the searches were done with the web history because there is a date and a timestamp you connect to when you hit certain websites or do searches. We've gone through this, but just for continuity purposes, I'll throw it in. On April 18th of 2022, the phone accessed a site, What Happens to Deleted Messages. May 10th of last year, how do police and forensic analysts recover deleted data from phones? One search was, can cops uncover deleted messages iPhone? How to permanently delete information from an iPhone remotely? Luxury prisons for the rich in America. And if someone is poisoned, what does it go down on the death certificate as? For the searches themselves, there was no date and time, but he did find corresponding websites to the searches that actually had the date and time in the web history. The searches were made from the middle of April of 2022 to about August of 2022, and it was off and on. They move on to cell phone tower mapping data. He explains how it works. Call detail records with tower locations. You compare those, and then you put it into software that shows you visually on a map the tower that the device was accessing when it received a call or a text. The cell phone companies can tell which tower and sector the phone used when receiving calls or texts, and there is an estimated range that can be a little ambiguous. It tells which side of the tower the phone pinged off of, and there are usually 3 different sectors on each cell phone tower. They can determine the orientation of the phone based off of those sectors. They mapped the data from CL's phone extraction and tracked the phone's movements on February 11th of last year. The phone was mapped at or near a Mavericks gas station, which is the date and location CL said she met the dealer to go get the fentanyl pills for Kouri. She shows up on the tower around 6:49 p.m. and stays till around 8 p.m. on the 11th of February from last year. The phone made calls and texts from the gas station to Kouri and another acquaintance who CL said is who she got the drugs from. The phone went to a location in Heber City, and the mapping he did of CL's phone was consistent with the account that she gave law enforcement about the very first drug purchase. Fast forward to March 9th of last year around midday. CL's phone was in Francis, Utah at or near the same Maverick gas station that was actually in Draper. The phone had communications while there with Kouri's phone. It went to a location in Midway, Utah that day. The movements for CL's phone were consistent with her statements to law enforcement. If you remember, Midway is the place where CL said Kouri had instructed her to put the pills into the outdoor fire pit, and then the money would be there. Eric's phone was also analyzed, and the last use of his phone was March the 3rd, 2022 at 9:58 p.m. He explains the UTC time that is given when they get the extraction, and it gets really, really technical, and I didn't have enough coffee when I was making my notes, but let's try. From November 2021 to March 13 of 2022, local time in Utah was in UTC -7. If those times are shown as UTC -5, that would be Eastern Standard Time. Because Utah is on Mountain Time, that puts it 2 hours behind Eastern Time. So if UTC -5 is Eastern, it would be UTC -7 to get Utah's time, if that makes any sense. On Cross, Sky asks about his testimony, saying there are 2 explanations why things might be missing on a device. Number 1, it's not captured in the download, and that can happen. He agrees, it can. Number 2, whether or not it has been deleted, and he says correct. Sky says all you can say in this case is that it is missing, correct? And he says that's correct. She says, with regards to movement, that could be any device that's attached to the phone through an app. And he says yes. She says, you can't say looking at what you analyzed exactly what device that was connecting. And he said, so far, I cannot. She says, and you can't tell where that device was in terms of location. And he said, that's correct. She said, it's possible that it could have been a device attached from some other location, but the phone's recording it. He said, that's really unlikely. And she said, but it's possible if it's connected to an app. He said it depends on the range. Outside of a certain range, it would be impossible. Sky and the witness, they both kind of have a good little laugh. And she says, excuse me, I'm not an expert in this. And she asks if there are a number of different programs and ways that extractions can be done on phones. And he says yes. She asks if he performed an independent extraction on any of the phones. And he said no. She asked if he analyzed any data prior to 2022 on CL's phone or Kouri's first phone that was seized. And he said he does not believe that he did. She asked if he was requested to only look at a particular date range. And he said not necessarily, but he was given the date range of interest. She says, you didn't cross-reference the frequency of communication between CL and Kouri prior to January of 2022. And he says, correct, I did not. She says, it could be they communicated all the time and you didn't know this. So this could have been a normal course of communication between Kouri and CL, and he says, of course it could be. She asked if he was made aware of when the first phone was seized and asks if he was given a copy of the search warrant, and he said no. She asks if he was aware the search warrant was in relation to a homicide they were looking at, and he said no. On Kouri's first phone prior to Eric's passing away, did you review any search history from the web browser? And he said he did. She asks, were there any searches related to fentanyl on that? And he says not that he found. But not many searches were available to look at. She asks about no searches for prisons, how to delete messages, anything. He said, nope, didn't see it. She asks if all the searches came from the second phone, and he said they were. These were from the replacement phone that was ultimately seized earlier this year. She moves on to the mapping of the locations and asks if he looked at the mapping on Kouri's second phone. He said he did not. She said the state didn't ask you to compare CL's phone to Kouri's. He said they did, but the mapping location for those call detail records were no longer available through Verizon on either phone. She says, so you were able to get them off of CL's phone, but not Kouri's? And he said, that's correct. She said, on March 9th, you say CL was at the Maverick and asked what time she was there. And he says 2:33 p.m. Then she asks if CL went back to Francis, and he said she went back to Heber. She asks if CL lives in Heber, and he said she does. That was the end of cross, and there was no redirect. The next witness up was Brooke Carrington. Now, we're going to get into some of this mortgage stuff, and she did an amazing job. She put this in really good layman terms for people like me who are not up on anything having to do with math and all mortgages and all that stuff. She's the owner of a financial forensics company, and she does forensic accounting and mainly traces bank transactions in cases of fraud or misappropriation of funds. Hence, why Miss Carrington was in the hot seat. Miss Carrington was contacted by the investigator for Eric's estate. The two of them are longtime colleagues and associates. The estate hired her, and also she was later retained by the Summit County Attorney's Office on May 31st of this year, so just a few weeks ago, before this hearing took place. She reviewed bank account statements, tax return documents, real property records, specifically trust deeds and warranty reconveyance. That's a document that transfers the title of a property from a mortgage lender to the borrower once the loan's been paid. She also reviewed insurance policies, documents, tax information. And with Kouri, she owns several businesses, and the most relevant to this is K. Richins, LLC. She explains that Kouri flips homes, but also acts as a realtor. The business was registered in April of 2019. She was able to find records of the homes Kouri was buying and selling because they're public documents. Most states go through the county recorder to do that. The prosecutor shows her a schedule she prepared and the analysis. This is a chronology she identified for Kouri personally or her company. The timeline they were acquired, it was on the front end of her ownership. In 2019, Kouri had two properties, one being the home that she and Eric were living in and the $250,000 revolving line of credit. And the second was a different property. I've been traveling more this year than I have in a really long time, and I'm known to be an overpacker even when it comes to a short trip like the one I'm taking just this week. Base is the best piece of luggage I've ever owned. With the built-in bag for items that may spill to the built-in weight indicator and cushy handle, not to mention the 360-degree spinning wheels, Base has made my travels so much easier. I love the washable bags for your dirty clothes and shoes. It's the little things I don't think of that Base did. So whether you're packing for a quick trip or looking to breeze through the security line, Base has your personal items covered. Right now, Base is offering my listeners 15% off your first purchase by visiting basetravel.com/whattheworld. Go to basetravel.com/whattheworld for 15% off your first purchase. That's Base, BEIS travel.com/whattheworld. You will not regret it. I own every piece they have, and I love it. She had the trust deeds, and trust deeds are deeds recorded at the county recorder's office to document an obligation on a property and a loan for a certain amount. Trust deeds are deeds recorded at the county recorder's office to document an obligation on a property, a loan for a certain amount. That amount is documented on the trust deed. The amount of the trust deeds in 2019 were $471,210. In 2020, the amount was $2,069,280 on 5 separate properties. In 2021, the amount was $6 million on $260,450 on 13 properties. The witness thought this was significant because on one hand, it actually is positive because it means she's actively acquiring properties. But on the flip side, that can be problematic because too fast of a growth is challenging for a business. She doesn't have the documents that tell the term of the loans that Kouri had, the interest rate, or the payment required. She said she did know that these are hard money lenders, and on some of these, what they require is anywhere between 12 and 15%. These aren't conventional loans for 30 years that you normally take out. They're short-term loans, and people who flip houses turn those properties over really quickly, so they don't need the typical 30-year mortgage that most of us get just to buy a home. She said, I don't know the balance at the end of a typical time period. I would need the loan documents, the promissory notes, and ledgers from the lenders to show what payments were or were not made and when they were made, how interest was calculated. Typically, the lenders have significant loan origination fees, and if payments are late, the interest rate gets higher on the late payment, and perhaps you have default fees and things like that. At the end of 2021, Kouri was obligated on the debts, listen to this, y'all, for a little over $4 million. She doesn't know if that's all the properties. She did a thorough search, but she said there could have been more properties that Kouri owned. She also looked at Kouri's bank accounts. Servicing of debt is that there's an outstanding debt and the servicing is the payment on that debt. She explains that servicing of debt, there's an outstanding debt and the servicing is the payment on that debt. She explains it's kind of like how we pay credit cards. You make the payment and it is put on the balance due. Kouri's debt payments in December of 2021 alone was 94 payments totaling $252,000. She said this is significant about the debt payments because they weren't for 94 different entities. Some were weekly payments. For example, Kouri had one outstanding debt where she was paying $5,438, and that was required to be paid weekly. Holy moly. She had a $600 payment she was making daily for a period of time during December of 2021, and the payees on most of these debts were those hard money lenders, and also some was credit card debt. This was just in one account. That was an America First Credit Union account. So Ms. Carrington was able to determine that she was behind on at least one account, and they had filed suit against Kouri on December 9th of 2021. They filed the agreement And Kouri used $87,000 of her receivables, which are potential revenue, work she has performed or earned and expects to be paid the money to her company. That $87,000 was stated in the case document. The agreement also said that she was borrowing $60,000 against the $87,000 at 15% interest. The complaint says she is to make weekly payments of $5,438 until the debt is paid. She made payments totaling $21,000, which is just shy of 4 payments. And then after that, she defaulted. She looked into the bank account, and while she can't say for which loans, she saw that some of the payments did not clear the bank that were sent to hard money lenders. She looked into the bank account, and while she can't say which payments were for which loans, she saw some of the payments did not clear the bank that were sent to hard money lenders. This one bank account of hers was in the negative for $22,000 a good part of December of 2021. Kouri also had 11 or 12 other bank accounts. Some were significant and some were not. So let's look at the K. Richins Realty. They identify as number 6577. This is primarily where the transactions were made to the hard money lenders. She was paying overdraft fees of $25 each, and there were dozens. The one overdrawn for $22,000. So another account they identify as 2204 was the joint personal account of Eric and Kouri's. The witness likes to look back to see the lead up to a significant time period, which helps her understand the nature of the account. So she went back to 2020, which is further back than needed, but it helps her see how it was used and what's typical for that account. The account was used to pay off credit cards or kids and family expenses. But what stood out to her as we get closer to the months leading up to Eric's death, there are transfers between and amongst accounts. She can see Eric's paycheck coming in, transfers for Kouri's account into that one, and payments going back to her. There's an increase in transactions in the accounts in late 21 up to Eric's death in March of last year. Is significant to her because she's looking for what's typical and what makes sense with the account. What's happening in the business account, and does that influence what happens in the personal account, along with what's happening in the acquisition of properties and how those things kind of ebb and flow together. In the months leading to Eric's death, there's indicators of increased chaos and loss of control, larger amounts of money moving all around these accounts. And she said it just feels haphazard. There are transactions that don't clear when there's money being moved around to cover transactions. They move to account number 5244. This is a personal account opened in 2013. The header of the account has Kouri's name, but the signature card has both Eric and Kouri's name as joint account holders. She thought it was a business account, but technically it's a personal account according to the bank. But she said it's used primarily as a business account because of the transactions contained in that account, such as payment to the loans on the properties, expenses that are typical of a business rather than personal. But there are personal expenses tucked in there as well. There were credit card payments coming out. And at the end of 2021, the account was in the negative for about $1,100 up to $1,700. And the line of credit was $3,200, which was completely tapped out. Transactions that didn't clear came from all the accounts mentioned so far. A transaction on October 13th of 2021, a check came in from a credit union called PenFed for $4,000 into the 6577 account, which is K. Richins' or business account. PenFed, that's a credit union where Kouri had accounts, but Eric did not. She said this becomes significant later, but that check that was deposited into the account was returned unpaid. There were transactions made out of the account between the time the check was deposited and it came back unpaid. There were a couple of checks deposited on November 12th of 2021 that did not clear. After those checks were deposited, there were payments sent out before that check was returned unpaid. On December 23rd of 2021, a check for $10,000 was deposited from Navy Credit Union. Well, that didn't clear either. And what she explains is sometimes it can take a while for your bank to realize there's insufficient funds. So the deposit is credited to your account, and it kind of depends on how the two institutions work together. Sometimes that deposit will go in overnight. Sometimes it takes a few days. In this case, it took around 4 to 5 days. There were two that didn't clear that came from Kouri's Navy Federal Credit Union to her American Credit First account. Between the time the check was deposited and came back unpaid, there were transactions paid out of the account. So essentially, what Kouri was doing was cutting herself a check from one account, knowing there were insufficient funds, depositing it into another account to shoot payments out to keep, I guess, these hard money lenders off of her. But before the banks could communicate and say, wait, there's not enough money here, she had already made the transactions and then the check was returned. So you see, it's a vicious cycle that she was in. There really wasn't a way out for her that I can see. And look, I'm a dummy when it comes to math, but I'll tell you, just listening to this testimony, she was in past her eyeballs in debt. And I wonder, really, I don't think that Eric could have known how bad it really was. In the 6577 account, she said it was overdrawn again prior to Eric's death. And she doesn't remember the amount, but she does remember it was in the negative. They were going to talk more about bank accounts, but remember, this is just a bond hearing. It's not a trial. And the judge asked the state to move on. They move into life insurance policies. And there were 6 life insurance policies on Eric at the time of his death. And then you see her mouth to herself, 7. But the policies were a Minnesota Life for $347,000. That's a home mortgage policy. So if the insured passes away, the home's paid off. It's written for the loan balance at the time the policy is taken out. Whatever the outstanding loan is at the time of death, they will pay 72% of the outstanding loan, and that was paid after Eric died. The prosecution says instead of going through each one of these policies and not considering the one he had with his business partner Cody for that buy-sell agreement, remember we talked about that, the total amount aside from the business that Eric was insured for at the time of his death was around $1.2 million. They talk about Kouri trying to change that beneficiary from Eric's business partner from Cody to herself and then back again and back again. Kouri ultimately got a little more than $1.3 million paid out to her from the life insurance policies in June of last year. She also reviewed the PenFed accounts, and most of the time it had $5 in it. On cross, Sky says she'll be really quick, and she says you look at investment type businesses as well as personal finances. You said Kouri Richins Realty was essentially flipping houses. What type of business model is investment properties that you don't own for a long period of time and that you sell quickly? And she said within the framework of that, it wouldn't be uncommon to have these hard money lenders as part of that type of business model. So the witness says, I did say that is typical. And Sky says, we're not going to go get conventional home loans for a home we're going to own for 6 months, correct? And the witness says you could. It would be a lower interest rate, even though it had a longer repayment period. And Sky says it would be hard to get conventional loans when you're continually buying multiple properties. The witness says, I don't know the answer, but it's typical for someone in Kouri's industry to use hard money lenders. Sky said, you created the schedule of homes, and did you see when they sold? She said, yes. Sky asked, did you correlate those payments and see what the homes sold for? She said, yes. Sky says, if you look at those properties, she only still owns a handful of those properties, 4 to 5, maybe. And the witness says 6 or 8. Sky names off some properties. I counted 4, but we kind of moved on. And she asks the witness if she looked to see if Kouri partnered with anyone on the loans. The witness says the trust deeds did not show that. Sky says, so you wouldn't know if there was some kind of a partnership on those? And the witness says, actually, you would, because it would be reflected on the trust deed, and she never saw any partnerships. Sky asks if she saw the balance in the 2204 account at any time period. Sky says there were fluctuations in her business account. There was always a positive balance in the 2204, correct? And the witness says no. There were periods where that account was also in the negative. Sky says, you said Eric was on the 5244 account, which was being used for business type stuff for Kouri's business. She said he was on the signature card. So when you open an account, he signed as an authorized signer and Kouri did as well. Sky asks, as an authorized signer, would Eric have had access to review the account? And the witness said it all depends on how it's set up with online access. And just because he's on as an authorized signer, it doesn't mean he could have walked into the bank and gotten any information he wanted. The account wasn't in his name, it was in Kouri's. And looking at the transactions in the account before she looked at the signature card, it looked like a business account that just Kouri would have and not Eric. Sky says Eric had the stone masonry business and was on some level assisting her with the remodeling and cleanup of these homes, correct? The witness says that's not how I would term it. So Sky says, I'm not saying financially, but he did some work on these homes. The witness says, I'm aware of one home he and his business partner, Cody, contributed about $133,000 towards the completion of the home. That was the end of cross. The state enters in some jail calls before they rest, and Sky says she could not find where she had been given any of the jail calls, so she said she would object to those coming in. The judge said, in fairness for the defendant and without having to postpone or continue this bond hearing, he won't consider the phone call that was entered in. So we're going to stop here. The next episode on this, I'm going to get into the victim impact statement that was very powerful from Eric's sister, Amy, asking the judge to deny Kouri bond, as well as the very brief closing arguments both sides gave. Then we're going to have Laura on to explain a little deeper about the financial mess that Kouri was in. According to Laura, it was bad. All right, guys. See you soon. Hope you have a good one.